Okay. All right, so to get started, I'm just going to go to the ArchivesSpace home, and you'll see here I'm in our production version of ArchivesSpace. Right now I'm logged in, and I'm in the binding keys repository. Does anyone have a suggested file? Not Theater Guild, though, because although I have tested that, it's fine, but we could do that if you want. Suggested ones. If not, I'll do binding key sand m, just because I was looking at that before and I had a particular thing I was going to look at. So feel free to suggest another while I do this. But for folks who haven't used ArchivesSpace before, I'm just doing a search here, and I'm using the EAD ID value. And part of the reason I chose that as an example is because that was one of those things that we don't get with the default MARC exporter from ArchivesSpace. That EAD ID value is not provided in the export. So that's why we needed to have the plugin. The plugin would ensure that we could add that EAD ID to our MARC file when ArchivesSpace exports it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had it to transform or do anything upon that data. So I've opened up this finding aid. Let's pretend that this is a new collection. The archivist has just finished, done all of their descriptive work in ArchivesSpace. They then have the option to download a MARCXML record. So I will just go ahead and click download MARCXML. The default here is listed to be include unpublished, and I would assume that's the process that folks would generally want to do when they're going through this, because they may not actually hit publish yet on the finding aid, but they still want to create the MARC record and get it ready to go potentially at the same time. So I'm going to hit download MARCXML record. And all this is going to do, just how ArchivesSpace generally works, it's going to take a file and put it into your downloads directory. A little bit laborious here, but what I'm going to need to do is now move this file over. You can see I downloaded a bunch of them. I need to move this over back to my directory where I'm going to be running the transformation, which I've happened to call ASpace plus MARC, into that ASpace directory, into an export directory, and I'm just going to paste that file there. So the idea is you could just build up a bunch of different files, or you could do this with one file as well. I'll pause real quickly to see if anyone has a suggestion for another record. And it doesn't have to be in the binding key. I can easily switch between repositories. Which was it? Okay, let's help me get to this. All right. First, I'll switch to the manuscripts and archives repository. And you say Gus, wait, sorry. Is that right? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to hear what the headphones are. All right, so Guts path, let me see, resource. Is this correct? Okay. So I'll go into view mode. You can go into view or edit, but since I'm in production, I'll make sure I don't want to accidentally update the record at all. Go ahead, export, download MARCXML. And I should say that MARC exporter plugin that we started with NYU's version and made a few customizations to, that just went into our production server last night. So now you can anyone can test this whole process. Previously, it was just in our test version of ArchivesSpace. So this is RU40, and I'll do the same thing. Let me just move this file over. All right, so now we got two files. Do one more. Thing, just because I'm lazy. So I'm just going to show an example of downloading multiple files at once. So all this is doing is basically using the ArchivesSpace API to do the same thing, but instead of me going to each finding aid in ArchivesSpace and then doing the download button, I'm just saying download everything in repository 8, which happens to be the Walpole. So they only have 6, that's why I'm not going to just specify certain collections. It won't take too long to download all of them. And once that's done, I'll have 6 extra files. So we should have 8 MARCXML records in this directory awaiting to be transformed. Before I actually transform it, I'll open up one of those files just so we can see what it looks like as it comes directly out of ArchivesSpace. Again, just kind of slowly walk through this process. We now have this export directory. We've got a number of different files here. These are the 6 files from Walpole, and this is that binding key file, and this is the manuscripts and archives file that we had downloaded. So if I open up one of these, let's go with the manuscripts and archives one, since I haven't looked at that yet. You'll see we have a pretty nice looking MARC record here. Luckily, actually, it is valid. Sometimes when ArchivesSpace is importer, you won't even get that at the first go, but it has some data in here that we're gonna be changing, and it's going to look a little bit different. We're trying to get this as close as possible, but it's not exactly at our final version of the way we would want it to look. Specifically, I think the 856 link is one of those things that will be changed during this transformation process. It won't just say finding data online with using code Z and code U for the subfields. So it's going to look a little bit differently after we run this transformation process. All right. So that's step 1, just download all your MARCXML files however you wish, get them in that export directory. This way it's set up at least right now. And the idea for step 2 is you would just run this batch file by double clicking on it and then waiting. And if you get any errors, reporting those to me. Right now, it should just basically give you a little bit of information about each file. And at the end, it'll give a little summary information about how many files it transformed. So this will take just a second since it's got to go through 8 files. But what's happening here is all of those files are being transformed to basically tidy them up slightly and to make some other changes. And then it's invoking MARCEdit to combine all of those files into a single binary MARC file. So we can just import the binary MARC file into Voyager rather than the MARCXML export, which is what we get from Voyager. So at the very end, it says 8 files moved, all done. Before I actually show the results, I'll just show you what happened. If I go back to the export directory, what happens is the idea is it'll just move all those files out because it's the process is going to go through all of those files each time you run the command. But instead of deleting those files or just getting rid of them, it'll move all of the files you had just transformed into a backup directory. So in case you wanted to inspect that or say, hey, what happened with that transformation, you'd still be able to go back and look at the basically the raw value you got out of ArchivesSpace. The only other thing that's changed here is now in the import directory. Oh, I meant to delete that other one. Let me delete the one that I'd done beforehand because I don't care about that. Just so it won't be as confusing. In the import directory, you're only going to get 1 file for each time you run that transformation. And that file is going to be named a little bit differently. It's actually using whatever net ID I'm logged into this computer to prepend the file name. So my net ID is MC2343. And then after that, it's just putting a timestamp on the file so that if I run this again, it's not going to overwrite that particular file. But you see I had 8 files as my import, and now I've got a single file as my export value, which I can now import into Voyager. If I right-click this before I actually import it, another thing we could do, and something we'll definitely want to do during testing, because there's still some changes we need to make to this, some of the MARC rules that we're using for the transformation process. I can preview this MARC file with MARCEdit, which is really nice, as long as you have MARCEdit on your computer. And so basically, this is just a big text file that includes all of that data that's now ready to go into Voyager with, one space here between each of those 8 record types. So that's essentially, where it's at right now. And then the final step, which is something I actually haven't done with multiple records yet, so we'll see how this actually works. Does it open multiple windows? Okay, that'll be funky. So I would say you probably want to limit how many you combine when we're opening the multiple windows. Well, let me log back into Voyager. And please remind me not to save this since I haven't switched successfully over to test Orbis. But I'll leave, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the process just go to record import? Okay, so go record import from new file, and then I need to navigate to that import directory that we had, select open, and I'll get a sequence. I guess, this is just telling me all of the records and pulling out the titles, which is nice. So we see, there's the manuscripts and archives record, the binding key record, and the 6 Walpole records. I guess if I click OK, this won't save this, right? Okay. Okay. So now, I have to go like this, or wait. Oh, so I only selected one. Okay. Well, here. Let me just close this guy. And I can go import from previous. Okay. Okay. Sorry, thank you guys for bearing with me. So yeah, should be able to get multiple windows. I mean, depending on how you'd want to do this. And I mean, I think we're hoping that we'll get to this point where there'd be no intervention necessary, and you could just save these records. I'm assuming that's not the case just yet. There's a number of things, I think, feedback that I've gotten from Stephanie and others about data. I mean, some of the stuff we would want to change, I haven't implemented just yet. I was just making sure we get valid MARC records as a first step. But there's some other changes that we would need to make sure that these are going to work without having to have any intervention whatsoever. But I think once we get to the point of, by and large, not needing any intervention whatsoever, we could also start thinking about ways that we could have this happen without even being mediated. It could just happen overnight, and then folks could get a report to say, hey, do you want to review the records that just got newly added to archives, to Voyager or overlaid in Voyager? If I can, is there an easy way for me to find? It's not going to be, oh yeah, until I save it, I guess. Oh yeah, here we go. So I've done a little, and this is actually one I think we need to still talk about in terms of how we enter the data into ArchivesSpace. But this is one example. I did try to update a little bit. It's still not I don't think a perfect way to do this. But you'll see here I'm getting two 506 notes, one saying the material is open for research, another saying, well, hold up, yeah, there's actually some restricted material in this collection. And so it's going to have a slightly different 506 note. This is actually being parsed from one single note in ArchivesSpace, because that's just our general practice. I think I would like to push for our practice to be a little different in ArchivesSpace, or we would have two different access notes, so we wouldn't have to worry about trying to parse that data. But right now I'm just parsing it and then looking for the word restricted somewhere to determine whether it should be a restricted 506 note. But again, because we're actually doing that post-processing step, we have a whole different types of options available to us in terms of how we want to process that data or anything else we need to do, fix subfields, fix what am I trying to say? Punctuation. And also I haven't looked into how this works out for the ordering of our MARC fields, but I have another process that could reorder these if we need to implement that as well. So I think right now this is just coming out the order that the ArchivesSpace plugin would export them, which might not align with how we want them exported. I haven't actually reviewed that. But that's, yeah, the whole process in a nutshell. I won't actually click save since I'm in production right now, but I guess that would be the next step. And then you would be alerted, I think, at that point if there's any other potential errors or whatever work you'd have to do after that. Okay, great. And I will put my ears off.